It's hard to keep track of all of President Trump's criminality, illegality, and corruption. Donald Trump took office for the second time, already an adjudicated felon, fraudster, and sexual assaulter. But this video isn't about those crimes and offenses. This is only about what has happened so far in the last year. Because, I'll be honest, there's so much of it that it's hard to remember. And I guarantee that you've already forgotten half of it. So buckle up, because there's going to be a lot. And programming note, because of some questionable acts by the Supreme Court, if something was illegal or constitutional at the time Trump did it, we included it in the list. We start with January 17th, 2025, because the corruption of his second term started just before he took office. On the eve of his presidency, instead of divesting himself of his conflict of interest-ridden businesses, Trump launched World Liberty Financial and a bunch of valueless meme coins. This allowed him to take bribes, engage in secret deals, and further enrich himself, all outside of many of the ordinary financial regulations. In Trump's first term, lobbyists, foreign governments, and Republican organizations curried favor with Trump by spending money at his Washington, D.C. hotel. But this time around, it's likely many individuals skipped the middleman and put money directly in Trump's pocket by buying the assets of World Liberty Financial and its various crypto offerings. Reports are that using World Liberty Financial, Trump has enriched himself by as much as $5 billion while in office. And it gets worse. We'll come back to that later. Then we get to January 20th. On Trump's first day in office, a flurry of executive orders. Now, I'll remind you, executive orders are not law, but they can direct federal agencies to do or not do things where the executive has discretion. In some cases, the president had the power, so to speak, but the acts were illegal or corrupt. In others, the president had no such power at all. So, starting things out on January 20th, Trump purported to eliminate birthright citizenship via executive order. This was a profound constitutional violation, particularly of the 14th Amendment and due process. Trump shut down asylum requests at the border, claiming that it was an invasion. This violated the INA and several other immigration-related statutes, as well as the Take Care Clause and separation of powers, since Congress had already created laws on this topic. Trump purported to rename the Gulf of Mexico. Mexico sued, claiming that he didn't have the power to rename an entire body of water, just the part in U.S. territories. Separate from the executive orders on January 20th, Trump pardoned the January 6th insurrectionists who had been criminally convicted by juries. Now, this may technically have been legal since the president can pardon people, but as I explained at the time, it shouldn't be. And dozens of these people had prior convictions or pending charges for crimes like rape, sexual abuse of a minor, domestic violence, manslaughter, production of child sexual abuse material, and drug trafficking. The Trump administration continues to intervene on behalf of the January 6th defendants. And of course, pardoning these traitors not only undermines the rule of law with respect to election integrity, but sends a message that if you commit a crime but you're on the president's team, that you'll simply not be subject to the same rules and laws as everybody else. But back to the executive orders on January 20th, Trump terminated federal employee telework agreements contrary to union agreements. Trump unilaterally withdrew from the World Health Organization, which violated international law. Trump sent the military to seal the borders. This was a violation of posse comitatus, which bars military engagement in civilian law enforcement activities. Trump reinstated the so-called Schedule F without going through any notice and comment process, potentially firing federal employees without going through the usual merit system protection process, a violation of the APA and civil service protections. Trump pulled security clearances from John Bolton and 50 other intelligence officials. This was an unlawful First Amendment retaliation and a violation of the APA and other federal regulations regarding security clearances. Trump unilaterally froze hiring in the government without any congressional authorization. Trump appointed Ed Martin to be the interim U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. Martin was entirely unqualified for the role. His only qualification was that he had promoted Trump's baseless stolen election claims. Martin went on to fire more than 24 prosecutors who had worked on the January 6th prosecution or the criminal investigation of Donald Trump, which was plainly retaliatory. Trump unilaterally paused the TikTok ban that had been passed by Congress and signed into law. Last time I checked, the president doesn't get to decide which laws to implement and which not to. Trump declared a legally dubious emergency at the southern border so he and Stephen Miller could carry out the plans to deport people en masse. This exceeded his legal authority and set the stage for a host of other legal violations. Trump rolled back a variety of energy-related regulations with no process in violation of the APA. He also froze all congressional funding to alternative energy projects in violation of the Impoundments Clause. Trump suspended the entry of refugees into the country in violation of the provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act and associated regulations. Going back to his greatest hits, Trump directed the construction of a border wall without congressional approval. This violated separation of powers and the spending clause. He terminated parole programs that had allowed immigrants to enter the country in special circumstances without congressional authorization or APA rulemaking. Trump reestablished the federal death penalty via executive order. He also directed the reconsideration of President Biden's grants of clemency, which is not a thing that you can do. Stick with me because we're only about halfway through the first day of the presidency on January 20th. Continuing on that day, Trump issued a memo making it easier for him to fire senior non-political leaders at government agencies. This was an effort to prioritize loyalty and fealty in violation of civil service protections and probably the First Amendment. Trump declared an energy emergency to get around regulations and laws. He even encouraged agencies to potentially use the Defense Production Act to do this. Trump shut down wind energy projects with no administrative process. Trump froze hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign aid. This was a violation of the Impoundment Control Act, the spending clause, and separation of powers. Trump directed construction of detention centers without congressional authorization. That was also a violation of the spending clause. And he unilaterally paused funding for immigration-related services and organizations, which violated those organizations' due process rights, separation of powers, and again, the Impoundment Control Act and spending clause. Trump issued an executive order that authorized a travel ban without specifying which countries would be banned. And of course, Trump created or repurposed Doge. Headed up by Elon Musk, who had reams of conflicts of interest, Doge worked to illegally fire federal workers in violation of civil service protections. Doge also illegally accessed sensitive personal data of millions of Americans, created unauthorized information systems, illegally combined federal databases, and just generally created chaos. And at the end of the day, contrary to the public releases, saved the government and taxpayers virtually no money. Trump issued an executive order that strictly defined sex and gender. The executive order required federal workers to genuflect to that definition, possibly in violation of their First Amendment rights. He unilaterally changed the rules around gender designation on passports, a possible violation of the APA, and also potentially violating due process rights, especially for trans individuals. The order also froze funding for a variety of entities that Trump claimed were promoting the vaguely defined gender ideology, which punished First Amendment protected speech and obviously was a usurpation of Congress's spending powers and an unlawful impoundment. Trump froze vaguely defined DEI-related contracts, another unlawful impoundment. He also liquidated federal DEI offices, yanked federal grants related to DEI, another unlawful impoundment, violation of the separation of powers, and First Amendment violation. Trump laid the groundwork to invoke the Alien Enemies Act against cartels like Tren de Aragua, likely ultra-virus because the act never contemplates the designation of non-state actors and criminal enterprises. Trump later used his designation to deny people basic due process rights and violate the processes of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Trump jawboned or encouraged in the way that the mafia encourages the end of DEI practices in private companies, again violating the First Amendment rights of private companies. And rounding out his first day in office, Trump granted clemency to 2 D.C. police officers who had been convicted for unlawfully pursuing a black scooter rider, killing him, then trying to cover up the crime. Of course, Trump has pardon power, so this one probably wasn't illegal per se, but it was still gross and negated a legitimate jury finding. That takes us to the second day in office, January 21st. On that day, Trump set aside a lawful verdict and issued a full pardon to Silk Road Darknet Marketplace creator, Ross Ulbricht. He was the first of many high-level business people to be granted pardons or clemency by Trump, especially those who paid lip service to Trump or his candidacy. Trump would go on to pardon Binance CEO Changpeng Zhao, Nikola Corporation founder Trevor Milton, and BitMEX founders Arthur Hayes, Ben Dilo, and Sam Reed, among others, many of whom contributed directly to candidate Trump and or had conflicts of interest with Trump's businesses. The message was clear: if you were rich, well-connected, and corrupt enough, even criminal convictions could be made to disappear. On January 23rd, Trump issued another 24 full pardons for individuals convicted of threatening or obstructing people who were trying to obtain or provide reproductive health services. This overturned lawful jury verdicts and undermined federal law, like the pardons for the January 6 rioters and the murderous police officers. This undermined the rule of law and making it clear that the only laws that mattered are the ones that Trump agrees with. On January 23rd, Trump's people ham-fistedly declassified and published records related to the JFK assassination, which included social security numbers and other personally identifiable information of several people in violation of privacy laws. Also on January 23rd, Doge set up an illegal, unauthorized, possibly unsecured server to email all government employees en masse, which violated the E-Government Act and lots of government security regulations and policies. On January 24th, Trump fired 17 inspectors general, the people looking for corruption, likely in violation of laws that created their offices and theoretically a violation of separation of powers. On January 27th, Trump kicked trans troops out of the military. This likely violated the First Amendment due process and equal protection rights of those troops. It also likely violated the APA as arbitrary and capricious. On January 28th, Trump's Doge used the previously discussed illegal OPM server, giving them the eponymous fork in the road offer. Unions sued, claiming the offer violated numerous laws, including civil service protection, separation of powers, and the Anti-Deficiency Act. On January 28th, Trump defunded research into gender-affirming care for minors. And while I disagree with the Supreme Court and think this is a due process and equal protection violation, it definitely was an illegal impoundment of congressional funds. On January 29th, Trump tried to keep teachers and schools from discussing a long list of ideas, concepts, and terms. violating their First Amendment due process rights. He pulled federal funds from schools that didn't comply, violating the Spending Clause, Impoundment Control Act, and the First Amendment. On January 31st, Trump worked to systematically destroy collective bargaining agreements for federal employees. This violated statutory collective bargaining rights and exceeded legal authority and violated the APA. Now, 200 news outlets reported on the terrorist organization designation, but depending on the sources you follow, it's hard to tell if they were even talking about the same event. When you scroll down to see how the story is being covered by every outlet, the frames can have a subtle difference that make a huge impact. The bulk of the reporting from the center got it right. Cartel de las Solas is not a real drug cartel, implying their legality concerns about the designation. In contrast, reporting from the right acknowledged that the designation was an allegation, but then focused on what might come next, implying legal validity. And on the left, headlines commonly use the future tense, implying that the designation hasn't happened yet, and thus legal questions remain open for challenge. Now, this type of analysis is why Ground News has been my favorite way to stay up to date with the news since 2023. So I want to thank them for sponsoring this video. They've been a longtime supporter of this channel and independent news media at large. Because Ground News is an app and website that helps me see the full picture by pulling in news from thousands of sources worldwide. I can compare coverage, uncover political bias, reliability, and most importantly, who owns the sources reporting from the news that you're reading. And it's not just me, Ground News has even been recognized by the Nobel Peace Center for its impact on media literacy. And there's probably someone at your holiday dinner table that you feel could benefit from seeing the news from different angles. So why not take advantage of Ground News Black Friday deal and get 50% off a gift subscription? One feature that someone in your life can definitely benefit from is the blind spot feature, which shows you stories that are underreported by either side of the political spectrum. And if you're only getting your news from one or two places, you might miss out on important stories like how Trump designated Egypt's former ruling party, the Muslim Brotherhood, as a terrorist organization. This was largely ignored on the left, or the story about Republicans' frustration with Pam Bondi and the Epstein files that was completely ignored on the right. But now, as a legal eaglet, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan, the same one that I use, by scanning the QR code or clicking on the link below. Or take advantage of the Black Friday deal and get 50% off a gift subscription. And by subscribing, you're also supporting an independent news platform that's working to make the media landscape more transparent and balanced. So go sign up for Ground News today, or I'll see you in court. Now let's get back to February of this year. On February 1st, Trump issued his first executive orders on tariffs against Mexico, Canada, and China. These would be the first of many. He has continued to go back and forth on tariffs ever since. Trump's tariffs violated a number of international treaties, including the USMCA, which he himself negotiated, the newer version of NAFTA. It violated constitutional separation of powers, the APA, and also exceeded his legal authority. On February 5th, Trump issued an executive order excluding trans women from women's sports and pulling funding from schools that did not comply. On that same day, Pam Bondi was sworn in as Trump's attorney general. She wasted no time and issued a flurry of memos, including one that would roll back enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, a lawfully passed congressional act. Again, the president cannot choose just not to enforce certain laws, which violates the Take Care Clause. On February 6th, Trump directed agencies to pull funding from NGOs that he didn't like. Trump also threatened financial and travel penalties against anyone involved in the International Criminal Court investigations into U.S. citizens. On February 10th, Trump pardoned disgraced former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich. Blagojevich had been lawfully convicted of corruption. This was the first of many corrupt politicians that Trump would pardon. Trump also eliminated the Federal Executive Institute without congressional authorization. And Trump unilaterally paused enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, an anti-bribery law that prohibits companies and individuals from paying foreign officials to gain business advantages. And it's super weird how the Trump administration just chose not to enforce myriad different corruption laws, and seemingly only corruption laws. And also on February 10th, Trump imposed a 25% tariff on steel. Like his other tariffs, he does not have this authority. On February 11th, Trump started broad, unjustified firings across the government. He gave DOJ authority to fire and said that new hires could only be brought on with DOJ approval. This violated the Impoundment Control Act, spending clauses, and plenty of union agreements and civil service protections. On that same day, in retaliation for the media company's refusal to use the ridiculous Gulf of America title, Trump banned the Associated Press from the White House press pool. This violated their First Amendment rights. Trump also imposed a unilateral 25% tariff on aluminum. On February 13th, Trump's OMB directed agencies to draw up plans to start firing federal employees en masse, laying off entire departments, and strong-arming remaining employees to leave. This violated civil service protections, but it also didn't matter because at the same time, he also pushed out the heads of the independent agencies, the Merit Systems Protection Board and Office of Special Counsel, who would have been able to adjudicate those employees' claims. The Supreme Court has now likely countenanced all of this activity, but at the time, it violated existing law. On February 13th, Trump pushed out Danielle Sassoon, acting U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and Assistant U.S. Attorney Hagan Scotton, as well as several others because they refused to drop bribery charges against New York City Mayor Eric Adams. Trump replaced them with someone more agreeably corrupt, and in April, the charges against Adams were dropped. It was clear that in exchange for this mercy, Adams agreed to cooperate with Trump's ICE enforcers. On February 15th, Trump ordered his Department of Education to begin investigating how to pull funds from schools with COVID vaccine mandates. This would potentially be a violation of the 10th Amendment, the Impoundment Control Act, and separation of powers. On February 18th, Trump seized control of all agencies, including independent agencies, forcing them to conform with his and Pam Bondi's interpretation of law. On February 18th, Trump's DOJ stopped defending EPA rules that the agency knew would save lives. This was likely arbitrary and capricious. On February 19th, Trump froze funding for sanctuary jurisdictions and any grants that give aid to undocumented immigrants, a violation of the spending clause and impoundment. On February 19th, Trump shuttered entire agencies, including the Institute of Peace, with a stroke of the pen. This violated the spending clause, separation of powers, and the Impoundment Control Act, and likely exceeded the president's authority. On February 25th, Trump went on a revenge tour against law firms that he felt had wronged him, pulling their security clearances and trying to pull their government contracts. This was retaliation for First Amendment protected speech, as well as a due process violation. On February 26, Trump directed all federal agencies to review grants, contracts, and loans and begin freezing anything DOJ deemed as inefficient. On March 1st, Trump opened up federal lands for timber harvesting in contravention of environmental laws in the APA. On March 5th, Trump's DOJ appointees began more aggressively investigating the University of California system for supposed anti-Semitism, and the administration began threatening grants and funding, often in retaliation for First Amendment protected speech. On March 6th, Trump continued his revenge tour against enemy law firms, yanking clearances and government contracts. Again, this was in retaliation for First Amendment protected speech and was a due process violation. On March 7th, Trump made it more difficult for employees in public interest fields to get student loan forgiveness the government had promised them, a violation of their due process and First Amendment rights. On March 7th, Trump DOJ leadership terminated pardon attorney Liz Oyer because she recommended against restoring gun rights to actor Mel Gibson. This was retaliatory in violation of civil service protections. On March 8th, Trump's DHS abducted and detained green card holder Mahmoud Khalil in retaliation for his First Amendment protected speech regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. This was part of a larger pattern of detentions and illegal retaliation against student protesters, including Rumeysa Ozturk and numerous others. On March 11th, Trump largely stripped authority from the Public Integrity Unit of DOJ, making it impossible to prosecute corruption crimes, which is pretty convenient for him and his friends because it cleared the way for a lot more illegal acts. It was also probably a violation of the Impoundments Act. Also on March 11th, in a Signal chat with Atlantic editor Jeffrey Goldberg, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth shared confidential and even classified information about impending military actions. Hegseth apparently accidentally added Goldberg to the Signal chat with pretty much every other U.S. national security leader. Holding these conversations over Signal, even without journalists present, was a violation of federal records laws, the Espionage Act, and probably several other national security-related laws. It was also really dumb, and no one has been punished for this act. On March 11th, Trump pardoned former Republican Tennessee State Senator Brian Kelsey, who had been found guilty of violating campaign finance laws. This set aside a lawful criminal conviction. On March 14th, Trump managed to push out another assistant U.S. attorney. This time it was Sean Murphy, who had prosecuted the January 6th insurrectionists. Murphy issued a resignation letter reminding his colleagues that, quote, "You serve no man." Murphy reported that after Trump pardoned the insurrectionists, they had threatened and harassed Murphy. Also on March 14th, Trump continued his revenge against law firms, this time against firm Paul Weiss. Again, this was still super illegal because it was retaliation against First Amendment protected activity. The same day, Trump unilaterally shuttered even more federal agencies, again, a violation of the spending clause, separation of powers, and the Impoundment Control Act. Trump began his campaign to coerce universities into doing his bidding. First, he hit Columbia University with a list of demands and a threat that funding would be pulled. Later, he moved on to Cornell, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and a long list of others. This violated their First Amendment rights, exceeded the president's authority, and violated the spending clause, often because Trump tied compliance with funding. On February 15th, Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act to go after a Venezuelan gang, Tren de Aragua. This exceeded his authority in the language of the statute. Trump also used his designation to deny people basic due process rights and violated the Immigration and Nationality Act. On March 15th, Trump's ICE agents detained Kilmar Abrego Garcia and shipped him off to a torture prison in El Salvador, along with plane loads of other people who had never been given any due process rights. This violated the Immigration and Nationality Act, due process, and international laws against torture. When federal judge Jeb Boasberg demanded that the Trump administration bring Abrego Garcia back and give him some due process, Trump's agencies openly flouted the law and the ruling. Boasberg then found probable cause and held the Trump administration in contempt for violating his orders. These contempt proceedings are still going on. On March 18th, Trump continued his war on independent offices, firing 2 FTC commissioners, violating the FTC Act and the separation of powers, though the Supreme Court now disagrees. On March 19th, Trump continued his war against the vaguely defined DEI, this time banning any words or ideas he liked from foreign service. This is likely a First Amendment violation. On March 20th, Trump unilaterally shuttered the Department of Education. This was a major violation of the spending clause, separation of powers, the Impoundment Control Act, and exceeded the president's authority. On March 20th, Trump proposed suitability regulations for federal employees that would allow the government to fire or not hire employees for vague reasons. In practice, this has turned into a loyalty test to the president, which violates the First Amendment due process and civil service protections. On March 20th, Trump commanded agencies to combine vast databases full of sensitive personal information and demolish legal protections that safeguard privacy. On March 21st, Trump began shutting down civil rights and civil liberties oversight offices at DHS. On March 22nd, Trump continued his revenge against his political enemies by pulling security clearances from Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, Liz Cheney, and a long list of others. As usual, this was retaliation for their First Amendment rights. On March 22nd, more revenge, Trump told his attorney general to pursue sanctions against lawyers or firms that were mean to him, notch up another violation of the First Amendment and due process. On March 24th, more tariffs. Trump instituted a 25% tariff on any country that traded for Venezuelan oil. This is the same violation as the last ones. On March 25th, Trump attempted to seize broad control over elections, changing voter registration requirements and forms, despite the fact that he actually has no authority over state elections. He once again threatened to pull federal funds from any state that dared defy him. On March 25th, Trump's administration changed a rule regarding unaccompanied minors with no notice and comment rulemaking process, making it more difficult for unaccompanied minors to get sponsored and leave detention facilities. On March 25th and 27th, more revenge, this time against law firms Jenner & Block and Wilmer Hale, different law firms, same legal violations by Trump. On March 26th, Trump pardoned Hunter Biden associate and fraudster Devin Archer, overturning a lawful criminal conviction for yet another corrupt figure, one who cast aspersions against the Bidens. On March 27th, Trump tried to rewrite history, strong-arming the Smithsonian, national parks, and other public institutions to ignore the uglier parts of American history and instead focus exclusively on American greatness. This probably violates the First Amendment rights of the park rangers and employees of the museums, who are no longer allowed to tell the truth about the gruesomeness of slavery, the injustice of Japanese internment camps, or any other of the worst parts of American history. On March 27th, Trump shredded union agreements and barred employees from collective bargaining. On March 30th, in public interviews, Trump begins refusing to rule out running for a third term, despite the fact that it would be blatantly unconstitutional. He'll continue to flirt with this over the coming months. On April 2nd, Trump set more tariffs. Lots and lots of illegal tariffs for pretty much every single country in the world. As usual, the president doesn't have the power to set tariffs, and it violated the separation of powers, the laws regarding tariffs, and uncountable international treaties. On April 3rd, Alina Habba, Trump's acting U.S. attorney for New Jersey, asked to dismiss a case against two American executives charged with authorizing $2 million in bribes to obtain a construction permit in India. This ignores the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is in keeping with Trump's disdain for that law. And it turns out that Habba was illegally appointed to that position. On April 4th, Trump once again unilaterally set aside the law that Congress passed barring TikTok, still a violation. On April 6th, Trump's DOJ fired career attorney Erez Ruveni after he refused to lie for the administration in court over its treatment of Kilbar Abrego Garcia. On April 8th, Trump tried to unilaterally negate state environmental laws, threatening to sue states and preempt their laws and withhold federal energy funding from those that don't back down. On April 8th, Trump unilaterally deregulated coal and explored coal mining on federal lands in violation of existing laws and the APA. On April 9th, Trump went after law firm Sussman Godfrey, another enemy law firm, and Chris Krebs, who dared to contradict Trump's made-up election fraud claims, as well as former Trump administration employee Miles Tyler. This was just as legal as all the other times he tried to do this. On April 10th, the BBC reported that the Trump administration had revoked hundreds of foreign student visas over First Amendment protected activity, which is unlawful retaliation under the Constitution. On April 11th, Trump sent the military to the southern border, possibly in violation of Posse Comitatus. On April 16th, Trump threatened to weaponize the IRS to revoke Harvard's tax-exempt status, a violation of federal tax law and due process, and exceeded the president's authority. On April 17th, Trump reopened parts of a marine national monument to commercial fishing, in potential violation of several environmental laws in the APA. On April 23rd, Trump demanded that the Secretary of Education and Attorney General go after higher education accreditors who promote DEI goals. This is again a violation of the First Amendment and due process. On April 24th, Trump pushed the federal government to more aggressively explore, permit, and develop deep sea and seabed mineral resources both off the U.S. coast and potentially in areas beyond national jurisdiction. On April 24th, Trump singled out Act Blue, a Democratic fundraising platform, by name in an executive order calling for the Attorney General to go after straw donors. Trump has gone after Act Blue several times, which is likely retaliation for First Amendment speech, viewpoint discrimination, and violations of the due process and equal protection clauses. On April 24th, Trump unilaterally repealed several civil service rules related to probationary periods. On April 25th, the Trump administration arrested Milwaukee Judge Hannah Dugan because she let a criminal defendant out the back door instead of out the front door, which led him to a hallway that took him right back to the main hallway where ICE picked him up. On April 25th, under the direction of Trump's Doge, AmeriCorps tried to cancel $400 million in grants with no process. On April 28th, Trump yanked funds for sanctuary cities, a violation of the Spending Clause and Impoundment Control Act. On May 1st, Trump unilaterally pulled federal funding from NPR and PBS. On May 9th, Trump tried to rescind water pressure regulations without going through any of the required notice and rulemaking. On May 19th, the Trump administration announced plans to begin weaponizing the False Claims Act to claim that DEI spending was somehow a criminal waste of tax dollars. On May 21st, Trump's Justice Department abandoned its consent decree with Minneapolis that was meant to address racially discriminatory policing. The DOJ refused to stand by the factual findings about police abuses in Minneapolis and 5 other cities, retracting them from the record and potentially allowing discrimination and police violence to continue without accountability. On May 21st, another federal judge found that the Trump administration had violated a court order by deporting immigrants to third-party countries without giving them due process. U.S. District Judge Brian Murphy declared that, quote, the department's actions in this case are unquestionably violative of this court's order. On May 21st, Trump accepted a $400 million jet as a gift from Qatar, which he is earmarked to use after he leaves office, which sure sounds like a law-breaking bribe. On May 23rd, Trump rewarded the people who made the biggest bribes, investments in his meme coin, with a lavish dinner at Mar-a-Lago. It was originally supposed to be at the White House, and promised a personal visit from the president. Just more corruption and ethics law violations. On May 28th, Trump pardoned a few more corrupt former politicians. This time it was Michael Grimm from New York, who had been convicted of felony tax fraud, and John Rowland from Connecticut, who had also been convicted of corruption. On June 4th, Trump unilaterally created a travel ban for 9 countries. Also on June 4th, Trump just shut down foreign student visas. Often the denials were tied to pro-Palestinian speech, which is First Amendment protected activity. On June 7th, Trump illegally mobilized the National Guard to help ICE in its immigration enforcement actions. He started in California in June, moved to D.C. in August, then Memphis, Chicago, Portland, and North Carolina. This violated the Posse Comitatus Act, exceeded the president's authority under Section 12406, and violated the 10th Amendment. Trump made the deployment in California doubly illegal by also deploying the active Marines. On June 13th, Trump's law enforcement agents dragged California Senator Alex Padilla out of a press conference. Also on June 14th, Trump threw himself a very expensive birthday party, $25 to $40 million expensive, and that was $25 to $40 million that Congress never allocated for that purpose. On June 17th, Trump's law enforcement agents continued their assault on Democratic legislators and politicians, arresting Brad Lander, the New York City comptroller, at a protest in violation of his First Amendment rights. The administration would go on to arrest pastors, judges, and pretty much anyone else who objected to ICE's increasingly aggressive tactics. On June 19th, Trump continued to delay faithfully carrying out Congress's TikTok ban. Same action, same violations. On July 9th, Trump's DOJ subpoenaed more than 20 doctors and hospitals that provide gender-related care to minors. The subpoenas likely violated privacy laws by demanding patient information. On July 11th, Trump's Attorney General Pam Bondi fired another 20 prosecutors and support staff who worked with Jack Smith to investigate Trump. This was clearly retaliatory and violated civil service laws. On July 17th, Trump unilaterally amended civil service regulations with no notice and comment rulemaking, making it easier to fire federal employees for not genuflecting to him. On July 17th, Senator Rob Wyden publicly accused Trump of refusing to enforce the law and investigate Epstein's financial ties. Trump denied this but killed the financial investigation and mysteriously continued to withhold the Epstein files. Under fire for handling of the Epstein case, Pam Bondi has now reversed course on investigating the banks. On July 17th, Trump fired James Comey's daughter, Maureen Comey. This was an obviously retaliatory and politically motivated act. She later sued, claiming this was both unlawful and unconstitutional. On July 23rd, Trump's Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, accused former President Obama of treason. This had no legal backing whatsoever and would be a retaliatory potential prosecution of a political enemy. On July 24th, Trump ordered the clearing of homeless camps and conditioned federal funding on cities doing his bidding to institutionalize and clear people. This violated states' rights in the 10th Amendment. Civil commitment procedures and local public safety laws are primarily governed by the state, not federal law. The federal government cannot compel states to expand their laws or amend their specific criteria for involuntary treatment. On July 30th, despite or maybe because of his prior unethical and corrupt actions, Emil Bovee, Trump's pick for an appeals court judicial position, is confirmed. Bovee had defended Trump in 3 criminal trials and had reportedly told his employees to disregard court orders. On July 30th, Trump continued to monkey with tariffs, eliminating de minimis duty-free provisions without congressional approval. On July 31st, Trump continued to mess around with tariff rates that he was not allowed to institute in the first place. Still illegal for all the reasons that we previously said. On April 6th, the bribes continue. This time it was a plaque from Apple with a 24-karat gold case. This joined a long list of other golden bribes, including a World Boxing Championship belt from Zelensky, a golden pager from Netanyahu, and a golden helmet from Japanese Prime Minister Shiba, a portrait from Putin, and a gold crown from South Korean President Lee. and of course the Qatari jet. For ethics-related reasons, no ordinary government employee could accept any of these gifts, but the jury's out on ethics rules and emoluments to the president. On August 11th, Trump tried to take over the DC Police Department. A court quickly struck that down because it was a violation of the Home Rule Act and exceeded his presidential power. On August 14th, Trump's Border Patrol chief, Greg Bavino, showed up with a group of well-armed Border Patrol agents outside of Governor Newsom's rally in what LA Mayor Karen Bass called a provocative act, and lawyers might call retaliation or intimidation that chills First Amendment protected speech. On August 27th, in what is likely a politically motivated investigation, Trump's FBI searched John Bolton's house. On August 25th, Trump tried to make it illegal to burn the American flag. Too bad the Supreme Court has already ruled on this, and prosecuting it would be a First Amendment violation. On August 25th, Trump tried to fire Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve Board. The administration falsely accused her of mortgage fraud to try and come up with a for-cause firing. On August 28th, Trump continued his vendetta against federal unions, barring more employees from collective bargaining. On September 2nd, Trump ordered the killing of 11 people in a boat off the coast of Venezuela. He claimed they were drug dealers, but there was never a trial or any kind of due process, nor any kind of congressional authorization, which is a massive constitutional violation and also murder. On September 8th, the Supreme Court signs off on racial profiling by ICE in the shadow docket, which sets the stage for ICE to continue using what are colloquially called Kavanaugh stops, where ICE detains U.S. citizens without probable cause. Generally, these are stops based on a person's race or use of the Spanish language. The Supreme Court has not yet weighed in on the merits of this decision, and it is likely a due process violation, and a violation of the Fourth Amendment. On September 15th, Trump launched a campaign to pressure networks to cancel comedians and commentators, and commanded FCC Chairman Brendan Carr to jawbone them, beginning with Jimmy Kimmel and later moving on to Al Sharpton, clearly retaliation for First Amendment speech. On September 15th, Trump decided to send the National Guard into Memphis. Though the governor approved, this would still likely be a violation of posse comitatus. A state court judge found that the deployment violated the Tennessee Constitution. On September 19th, Trump added an illegal and unjustified $100,000 fee onto all H-1B visa applications. On September 20th, in a clear First Amendment violation, Secretary of Defense Hegseth required members of the press to sign a new pledge. The pledge banned journalists from reporting on anything that Hegseth hadn't signed off on. Anyone who didn't sign it would be out of the DoD press pool. Only 15 reporters signed, and even Fox News and Newsmax opted out. Hegseth announced an entirely new, more compliant and right-wing press pool in October. On September 20th, after Trump said publicly, "I want him out," Eric Siebert, the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, resigned. He'd refused to go along with the Trump administration's politically motivated witch hunts against James Comey and Letitia James, among others. This was obviously corrupt and retaliatory. On September 22nd, Trump designated Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization, which is impossible because there's no such thing under American law. On September 22nd, numerous media reports claimed that the Trump border czar Tom Homan had accepted $50,000 in cash in a kava bag in exchange for plum government contracts. Homan denied he did anything illegal, but did not deny taking the bag of cash. And the Trump administration spiked the investigation into Homan's bribery. Trump issued a new executive order pertaining to domestic terrorism, specifically referencing the murder of Charlie Kirk. The order directs Bondi to establish a task force that would prosecute NGOs and American citizens under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The order created confusion about whether the FCPA, which was illegally paused, is now unpaused, and the order illegally targets Trump's political enemies for prosecution. On September 25th, Trump's lawyers issued a retaliatory indictment against his political enemy, Jim Comey. Prosecutors had previously declined to engage in this prosecution, so Trump just fired them and found someone less competent, Lindsey Halligan. Trump is also trying to go after New York Attorney General Letitia James, Adam Schiff, and John Brennan. On September 30th, during the government shutdown, Trump's OMB instructed employees to put politically inflammatory partisan messages out as their out-of-office messages during the shutdown. When employees didn't do that, some agencies changed the employees' out-of-office messages without permission. This was compelled speech in violation of the First Amendment and violation of the Hatch Act. It also violated the Anti-Deficiency Act, as were the bananas partisan banners put up on federal websites during the shutdown. On September 27th, Trump declared that he was sending troops to Portland, again a violation of posse comitatus, and exceeded Trump's authority under Section 12406. On October 6th, Trump sent the National Guard into Chicago against the wishes of the Illinois governor. Different jurisdiction, same violation. On October 11th, Lindsey Halligan, Trump's loyalist who was handpicked to prosecute James Comey, sent an unexpected signal chat to legal journalist and LegalEagle contributor Anna Bauer. In between chastising Anna for her reporting, Lindsey teased information about the grand jury proceedings against Comey, which is a bizarre departure from the usual rules of prosecutorial decorum, as well as the federal rules of criminal procedure. Additionally, the use of Signal with auto-deleted chats was a violation of federal records laws. On October 15th, Trump's team planned an IRS overhaul to pursue left-leaning groups, clearly a violation of First Amendment rights. On October 16th, Trump used research and development money to pay the military, despite the fact that the government was shut down. This violated the Constitution and the Anti-Deficiency Act. On October 17th, Trump commuted the sentence to the world's most prolific liar, former Republican U.S. Representative from New York, George Santos. On October 21st, reports are that Trump tried to force the DOJ to pay him $230 million for his prosecution of his illegal acts. This seems like an obvious conflict of interest and ethical violation, and if his minions in the DOJ approve this, it would also be well outside the usual bounds of the Federal Tort Claims Act. On October 23rd, Trump expanded his murderous strikes to non-adjudicated drug traffickers and civilians on a vessel in the Pacific, killing 5 people. Murder is still illegal. On October 23rd, Trump illegally ripped down the historic East Wing of the White House. Trump also illegally accepted gifts to help fund this act of vandalism. The funds to do any work on the East Wing have not been approved by Congress, another violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. On October 23rd, Trump's DOJ indicted Democratic congressional candidate Kate Abu for her involvement in protests at a federal immigration facility outside of Chicago. On October 24th, Trump accepted an anonymous $130 million donation to circumvent Congress's government shutdown. This is another violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. On October 24th, Trump killed 6 more people in another boat strike in the Caribbean. This was his 10th strike. He's up to about 64 people now, but murder is still legal. On October 25th, Trump appeared to be starting a war with Venezuela without any congressional authorization. On October 25th, Trump declared that he's going to send his people to monitor elections in California and New Jersey, which sure looks like unlawful voter intimidation. On October 28th, more retaliatory actions at the DOJ. This time, Trump's DOJ put 2 prosecutors on administrative leave because they had dared to mention in a memo that a guy who threatened former President Obama had reposted one of Trump's Truth Social posts, which had Obama's address. On October 31st, the Trump administration published a rule limiting public interest student loan forgiveness for anyone it decided was working for political enemies. On November 3rd, Trump sat down for an interview with 60 Minutes, which was then heavily edited, likely at his request, and probably because he filed a First Amendment violating lawsuit against the network last year for releasing an edited interview with Kamala Harris because they had edited it. On November 4th, Trump said he planned to ignore a judge's order that his administration pay out SNAP benefits during the government shutdown, which would be contempt of court. On November 4th, Trump was sued for months of inhumane conditions at the ICE facility in Illinois. These conditions have been repeatedly noted by judges and advocates across the country and violate due process and the 8th Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. On November 10th, Trump continued pardoning his buddies. This time it was Rudy Giuliani and others accused of the plot to overturn the 2020 election. On November 16th, another murder strike by the Trump administration, this time in the Eastern Pacific. The estimated murder count now stands at 83. On November 17th, Trump threatens to launch strikes against Mexico. Again, Congress has not approved any wars. On November 18th, Congresswoman Summer Lee launches an investigation into the Trump administration's choice to drop investigations against companies including Boeing and politically connected CEOs. An investigation by Public Citizen found that 30 corporations that faced federal investigations by the DOJ collectively gave $29.5 million to President Trump's inauguration fund. On November 18th, news breaks that the Trump administration had intervened to protect accused sex trafficker and professional misogynist Andrew Tate. Federal authorities were chastised for seizing Tate and his brother's electronic devices and told to return the devices to the suspects. On November 18th, Trump threatens ABC's broadcast license after an ABC reporter dares to ask Trump about his ties to Jeffrey Epstein. On November 19th, news breaks that apparently Lindsay Halligan and the Trump DOJ never actually presented the Comey indictment to the grand jury. They apparently can't even do politically motivated prosecutions, right? On November 20th, Democratic lawmakers who were members of the military and intelligence community made a commercial telling service members they have a duty to defy illegal orders. In response, Trump made a series of threatening posts on Truth Social calling for Democratic lawmakers to be punished with death for seditious conduct. These are the kinds of statements that would get anyone else arrested or at least investigated for terroristic threats or assault. But given presidential immunity, I guess it just doesn't matter. Trump said these members of Congress should be killed. He posted seditious behavior punishable by death. The Pentagon then launched a retaliatory investigation into Senator Mark Kelly. So there you have it. Those are all the crimes or arguable crimes, illegal conduct, and corrupt acts that we could put together. I'm sure we missed some. If we did, please let us know. We'll update the list and probably do this at least every year. And the next 3 years are going to be a rough ride for the rule of law. Of course, some of these acts have been ratified by the Supreme Court, and I'm sure that others will be in the future. Some are stuck in litigation. And of course, if you are fighting any of these acts by the Trump administration, you're going to need a good lawyer. Luckily, I know a guy. Now, all this highlights why it's so important to get a great lawyer when you're dealing with your own case. Now, after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems. And they'd ask, can you help me find a lawyer? How do I know if this attorney is any good? And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front and your lawyers only get paid if you do, to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. And when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. If we can't represent you, or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, a data breach, sexual harassment, a social security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could, but what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we partnered with, you'll get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why when you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle team.